We began our discussion last time of the Ukrainian Revolutionary Era, which, as you see on the chart that I have handed out to all of you, and we'll be continually referring to it at this lecture and also the next two lectures, that it was divided into three phases. Now, in the midst of what now was a war between the forces supporting the Ukrainian National Republic in Kyiv and the Republic of Councils, or the Soviet Ukrainian Republic in Kharkiv. The planned elections that were to take place to a specifically Ukrainian Constituent Assembly now proved impossible because of this war. But nonetheless, the Ukrainian Central Rada did meet in Kyiv on January 22nd, 1918, and then 3 days later proclaimed its fourth universal. Remember these decrees, these proclamations. So this was the fourth universal, January 1918. It proved to be the last of the universals that were issued by the Ukrainian Central Rada. But this one had finally reached that stage. It took four universals, in a sense, to do it. Why? Because this fourth one now, on January 22nd, proclaimed the complete independence of the Ukrainian National Republic. The proclamation was actually made on January 25th, but they dated it back to the 22nd. And for many years, January 22nd became Ukrainian Independence Day. With little regard, however, for these proclamations, didn't really interest the Bolsheviks. They continued to press forward from the east, and after a struggle, they had reached Kyiv. Changed hands several times, but it didn't take long before this Central Rada and the government of the now independently proclaimed Ukrainian National Republic by early February 1918 was forced to flee from Kyiv and move farther west to the western parts of Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Petrograd, still the capital of the former Russian Empire and now the Bolshevik state, but within a month it was going to be moved to Moscow. In any case, the Soviet government did make good on its promise, which they proclaimed already before and certainly after coming to power in November of the previous year. They made good on their promise to end Russia's participation in the war. Already in December, they entered into negotiations with Germany and Austria-Hungary, the two central powers, and the delegates met at a town called Brest-Litovsk, which is actually the present-day town of Brest in southwestern corner of Belarus, really on that little kind of triangular border between Belarus, Poland, and present-day Ukraine. So they meet in this place called Brest-Litovsk. For the Soviets, they desperately needed peace. They were still trying to establish control over this massive former Russian Empire. As for the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, they clearly would welcome the elimination of the Eastern Front, because then they could concentrate their forces on the Western Front, because they were stuck with two fronts during World War I. Germany, and most especially Austria-Hungary, were also in desperate need of foodstuffs. There was famine going on in many of the cities in that cold winter of 1917-1918. So they needed foodstuffs and also raw materials, which they hoped then to get from where? From Ukraine. And so in a sense, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ukrainian interests coincided. And as a result, a Ukrainian delegation from the Ukrainian National Republic was invited to Brest-Litovsk, and already on February 9th, the Ukrainian delegation signed a treaty at Brest-Litovsk. By the way, the Soviets were also there. It was their Minister of Foreign Affairs, actually Minister of War, Trotskii, opposed any idea of dismembering the Tsarist empire, but he was overruled by the very practical Lenin. Why? Because of the desperate need both for peace that forced the Soviet government to accept the provisions of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They finally signed it 1 month later on March 3rd. That's why we have these dates, February and March 1918. Now, why was this Brest-Litovsk Treaty, sometimes referred to during World War I, in general European histories as the Forgotten Peace, overshadowed by 1 year later the negotiations in Paris at the Paris Peace Conference. But this treaty did take place, international treaty. Why was it so important? Well, according to the provisions of the treaty, and then there were supplemental treaties and agreements signed throughout 1918 up to September. As a result, both Soviet Russia and the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and others as well, Bulgaria, Turkey, they all signed on to this, recognized Ukraine as an independent sovereign state. Soviet Russia agreed specifically, quote, to conclude a peace at once with the Ukrainian National Republic, and also to clear the territory of Soviet troops. So Ukraine is formally recognized as an independent state. As for the territory of that state, by the way, the Central Rada and the Ukrainian National Republic had previously proclaimed those nine heavily Ukrainian inhabited provinces from the old Russian Empire, but now it even got more territory as a result of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, called this whole southern area, Polisia in modern southern day Belarus, and also the Kholm region just west of the Bug River in modern day eastern Poland. Now, this initial signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, as I said, with the Ukrainian delegation, literally took place on the very day that the Central Rada was driven out of Kyiv, February 9. Driven out by whom? By the Bolsheviks. And actually, by then, all the major centers on the in the left bank Ukraine, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Poltava, Katerinoslav, modern-day Dnipro, all of those were in the hands of the Soviet Red Guards. And faced with such a situation, this Ukrainian National Republic, now internationally recognized, at least by the Central Powers and their allies, but driven out of its capital. And so the Ukrainian National Republic calls on the aid of the Central Powers. German and Austro-Hungarian troops promptly entered Ukrainian territory at the invitation of the Ukrainian National Republic. And with the support of the troops of the Central Powers, the Ukrainian National Republic forces were able to drive the Bolsheviks out of Kiev already on March 1st. But now this fledgling Ukrainian National Republic was in a dilemma, faced a dilemma. On the one hand, we have the Bolshevik threat to its existence. Actually, fighting continued in far eastern Ukraine until as late as April. It was clear that the Central Rada of the Ukrainian National Republic could only survive with German aid. But on the other hand, the Ukrainian National Republic was expected, according to the provisions of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, to supply huge quantities of grain, initially actually 1 million tons of cereals already by the end of July, and other foodstuffs. But they could only get that from whom? From what by now was a very reluctant peasantry in Ukraine that's not about to give up their grain. And so the government already has to do it by forced requisitioning. But after now 1 year in a revolutionary environment with actually little effective governmental authority anywhere throughout the former Russian Empire and certainly in the countryside of Ukraine, the peasantry was not about to give up its grain without a struggle and just simply at the behest of some far-off government in Kyiv, which ostensibly was speaking on behalf of Ukrainian national interests. And the result? Tension between the peasant countryside and the Central Rada, and most especially between the Central Rada and its Central Powers, in particular German protectors. They're supposed to provide them with these supplies and grain. And so it was not long before the Germans became convinced that this Ukrainian government was an ineffective ally in its efforts to acquire raw materials and foodstuffs. And so the Germans laid plans to install its own Ukrainian government. And on April 28, 1918, the German army deposed the Central Rada from power. And hence begins the second phase of our Ukrainian Revolutionary Era, as you can see on the chart. Second phase running from April to December 1918. It is known as the Hetmanate. It was much shorter than the first phase, lasting, as you can see, only 8 months, from the very end of April until mid-December 1918. And it has become known as the Hetmanate. Why? Because the government that replaced the Central Rada of the Ukrainian National Republic was headed by a chief of state who carried the title Hetman, recalling the days, historical days of the 17th and 18th century, the Zaporozhian Cossacks, the autonomous Hetmanate that existed then in the 17th and 18th century. So in a sense, this was the second Hetmanate on the territory of Ukraine. And so headed by a hetman, hence the term Hetmanate. We saw how Germany and Austria-Hungary were increasingly displeased with the Central Rada's lack of enthusiasm or inability to supply the Central Powers with foodstuffs. And so on April 26th, the Chief of Staff of the German Army that was stationed in Ukraine, a man named General Groener, met with a man named Pavlo Skoropadskyi. He was a lieutenant general in the former Russian Imperial Army. And the German general proposed to him that he become ruler of Ukraine. The conditions proposed by the German military actually would have amounted to a virtual surrender of sovereignty on the part of Ukraine to the occupying powers. Actually, the Germans themselves had already begun requisitioning grain directly from the peasants, not even going through the from their perspective, ineffective Ukrainian National Republic. But now, they preferred, actually, because it caused some problems, as we're going to see, to say the least, let's have a quote-unquote Ukrainian government do this for them. Now, among the conditions that the Germans put forth to Skoropadskyi were the following. Acceptance of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that's a given, so it's an international treaty. Abolition of the Central Rada's Constituent Assembly. German control over the size and disposition of the Ukrainian army. A German approval of all cabinet ministers in the government. Abolition of all limitations on the export of raw materials, or for that matter, manufactured goods. A recognition of the rights of the large landowners, this whole question of land. And payment for land if and when any of those holdings would be divided. Pretty wide-ranging demands, to say the least. Skoropadskyi accepted them all. Now, the conditions set forth by Germany, the acceptance of them by Skoropadskyi, represented what we can call a swing to the right in the political spectrum of this Ukrainian Revolutionary Era. And not only was sovereignty undermined, but also the generally left-wing, sometimes one would think even radical trend of the Central Rada on the land issue. The Central Rada and the Ukrainian National Republic were more or less socialist in orientation, not Marxist, but socialist in orientation. And that was made clear by the previous universals that they had issued. Now this was put to a halt and actually reversed. Skoropadskyi's state had the military backing of the German army, German and Austro-Hungarian army, because the Austro-Hungarians were also there. Ukraine was actually divided between two spheres, the German sphere and the Austro-Hungarian sphere. So they had the backing of the Central Powers, or Skoropadskyi did, and also the backing of the well-to-do, large landowning, commercial, and administrative social strata in Ukraine. Most of these social strata had been Russianized. In that sense, they were little Russian Russians. And therefore, they were very much opposed to the Ukrainian nationalists in this Ukrainian National Republic, and certainly what they considered the radical socialist positions of the Central Rada. And technically, to make this seem that this was being carried out by inhabitants of Ukraine, and actually they are inhabitants of Ukraine, regardless of their political and social position, a group of as many as 6,400 delegates from 7 of those 9 quote-unquote Ukrainian provinces gathered in Kyiv on April 29 in what they called a Congress of Landowners Alliance. And it was this Congress who greeted Skoropadskyi, and it was this Congress who conferred upon him the title of Hetman of what was formerly called the Ukrainian state, Ukrainska Держава. So we don't have a Ukrainian National Republic, now we have a Ukrainian state. That's literally what it was called. Who was this Skoropadskyi? Interestingly, he was a descendant of the early 18th century Cossack hetman, whose name was Ivan Skoropadskyi. He actually was the one that the then Muscovite government organized after the in the course of the Great Northern War, in which the Ukrainian hetman Ivan Mazepa had joined the Swedes against the Muscovites. Muscovites then, for all intents and purposes, put down their foot, abolished much of the autonomy, and they appointed, or arranged to have appointed, Ivan Skoropadskyi. Well, this Pavlo Skoropadskyi is his descendant. And in that sense, he had a long and distinguished Cossack lineage. His ancestral forebears were among those in Ukraine who had enthusiastically entered into the ranks of the Russian nobility and who became entrenched as part of the leading social stratum in 19th century Russian-ruled Ukraine. And it was this Cossack gentry, if you will, gentry social stratum, which most naturally had adopted what we spoke about last time when we were discussing nationalism. These were the figures who adopted this hierarchy, or represented the hierarchy of multiple loyalties, so that its members were simultaneously Little Russians, loyal subjects of the Tsar, and thereby Russians as well. In effect, Skoropadskyi remained consistently opposed to revolution of any kind. Nationalist, socialist. And for this reason, he was the ideal leader for the financially and socially entrenched social stratum that was represented in the so-called Congress of Landowners. It's also important to note here that Skoropadskyi was welcomed as well by that other important element in Ukraine, an element that desired stability, the church, the Russian Orthodox Church hierarchy in particular. The church had hardly been appreciative of the Central Rada. Its Third Universal back in November had confiscated church land holdings. Now, the Orthodox Bishop of Kyiv blessed the Hetman in a special service called the Moleben, or the service of thanks or gratitude, that was held in the historic Cathedral of St. Sophia, went back to medieval times, in the center of Kyiv. The point here is that the new ruler, our Hetman Skoropadskyi, received the imprimatur of the established strata in Ukrainian society, that is, the well-to-do social and political elite, and the Russian Orthodox Church. And with this backing from local leaders and supporters, or supported at the same time by the German and Austro-Hungarian military, Skoropadskyi proceeded to dissolve the Central Rada. It was actually meeting at the same time in another building, and not far away from the cathedral, just down the street, actually. And one of the first things he did was to restore the right of private ownership for the big landowners. I guess it's not surprising that the government of the Skoropadsky-led Ukrainian state was opposed by all left-of-center political parties, whether or not they were sympathetic to Ukrainian nationalist demands. And as a result, Skoropadsky was forced to surround himself with a government described by one of its own members, actually one of the rare Ukrainians in his government, as a Ukrainian patriot, that is, or specifically believing in Ukrainians as a distinct nationality, was this historian Dmytro Doroshenko, but he described Skoropadsky's government as, quote, Ukrainian by blood, but Muscovite in spirit. That is, these little Russians of the pre-revolutionary imperial variety. As for the German military, the very force that had made Skoropadsky's accession to power possible, the German military was given a free hand to obtain the grain that Germany, and most especially Austria-Hungary, needed so badly. In cooperation with the large landowners, the Germans frequently led punitive expeditions against this otherwise uncooperative peasantry. It's kind of a peasant war now broke out, or a war against the peasants. As a result, forced collectivization of fines, shooting of hostages became the order of the day throughout the Ukrainian countryside throughout the summer of 1918. And actually, many German soldiers were killed as well. Already in May, a Ukrainian peasant Congress that met in Kyiv lodged strong protests against the Skoropadsky government. Some of the opposition forces crystallized into a new organization called the Ukrainian National State Union, or simply the Ukrainian National Union. So this is now an opposition force, almost from the beginning of Skoropadsky's rule. It included representatives of most of the political parties, because most of them were socialist in orientation anyway, also of postal, telegraph, and railroad workers, and also the Alliance of Zemstvos, which was an agrarian-based organization created by the Russian imperial state already before the war, representing the rural areas. Now, while it is true that Skoropadsky's rule was based externally on a German and Austro-Hungarian military presence, and internally on the support of the Russianized or Russified upper stratum of Ukrainian society, despite that, this rule or this period of the Hetmanate did have some positive, one might say very positive, impact on the Ukrainian national movement. I mean, theoretically, they're opposed to this. Yet, it was a Ukrainian state. First of all, Skoropadsky's government recognized, and this was at the initiative of the Central Powers, the provisions of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And therefore, it was a Ukrainian state that was actually mentioned in the treaty. And nor was it a Ukrainian state simply in name. The educational reforms begun by the Central Rada already back in 1917, and which had led to the Ukrainianization, the introduction of Ukrainian in elementary schools, in secondary schools, gymnasia. Also, Ukrainian courses for teachers so that they could know how to teach this Ukrainian language, to the publication of Ukrainian textbooks. So all of this was begun by the Rada, 1917, and now continued under the Hetmanate. For instance, during a few months in 1918, there weren't many of these months when the Hetmanate was in power, the Ukrainian state, close to 2 million copies of Ukrainian language elementary and secondary textbooks were printed. And here was a language that didn't exist, technically. Everything was in Russian. Now we have all of these Ukrainian language textbooks. Even more impressive gains were made at the highest educational levels. In October 1918, new universities were opened in Katerinoslav, modern-day Dnipro, also in Kamianets-Podilsky, far in the west, almost on the border with Austria. A College of History and Philology was opened in Poltava. Each of these institutions had departments in Ukrainian subjects and taught in Ukrainian. And then, aside from that, departments in Ukrainian language and history, art, and law were opened in the older universities, whether in Kyiv, St. Volodymyr University, or in Kharkiv, or in Odessa. And Kyiv became, in the fall of 1918, the seat of the Ukrainian Academy of Fine Arts, the National State Library, the National State Archives, and on November 14th, the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. All these institutions, by the way, still exist today, and they were all founded during this allegedly Russified Ukrainian state under Skoropadskyi. And so, the Hetmanate has to be credited with going very far in creating an intellectual and educational infrastructure for a Ukrainian state, of which it was called. Less successful, at least from the perspective of Ukrainian nationalism or the Ukrainian national cause, was the situation of the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox in Ukraine, ever since the late 17th century, were under the jurisdiction or within the framework of the Russian Orthodox Church, which once again now was headed by a patriarch in Moscow. During the revolutionary period, however, some patriotic Ukrainian clergy and civic leaders hoped to separate from the Russian Orthodox Church and to create their own self-governing, jurisdictionally independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church. But those efforts were blocked by the Russian Orthodox bishops in Ukraine, almost all of them totally opposed to anything Ukrainian. And they effectively were supported by Skoropadskyi. Despite the Hetmanate's achievements in the realm of, as we've just seen, Ukrainian education and cultural institutions, by the fall of 1918, its days seemed to be numbered. Because it was dependent, effectively, almost exclusively, on Germany and Austria-Hungary, as the war efforts of the Central Powers declined, we are now in the fall of 1918. The war is winding down. It's not looking good for the Central Powers. And so, therefore, so too, it didn't look good for Skoropadskyi's German client state. Skoropadskyi and his government trying to figure out now what are we going to do. They even sent out feelers to the Allied powers. Tried to negotiate with that oppositional group, the Ukrainian National Union within the country. The union was headed by a man named Volodymyr Vynnychenko, trying to get them involved in the government. But within a couple of weeks, relations with the opposition, this Ukrainian National Union, broke down, and the union itself made plans for an uprising against Skoropadskyi. And then we have the Ukrainian Bolsheviks. I mean, they didn't go away. They even undertook a revolt that didn't work out against Skoropadskyi way back in August. And they certainly were capitalizing on peasant discontent against his regime. And they were still spreading revolutionary propaganda among the war-weary German soldiers. Finally, in an attempt to save the rapidly deteriorating political situation, Skoropadskyi carried out his own coup. He appointed a new cabinet and, in effect, abandoned the idea of Ukrainian statehood. On November 14th, he proclaimed the Federative Union of Ukraine with some future Russian, certainly non-Bolshevik state. It wasn't clear whether the Bolsheviks were going to control Russia. There's still a war, as we're going to see, going on. And so now Ukraine should be part of this new non-Bolshevik Russian state. This turn on the part of Skoropadskyi to a Russian alliance completely alienated the Ukrainian National Union, and their leaders now formed their own conspiratorial government that they called the Directory. The Directory. And the Directory was now headed by two individuals, this Volodymyr Vynnychenko and Symon Petliura. Vynnychenko received assurances from Soviet representatives that Soviet Russia would recognize the Directory after it came to power. In return for what? In return for allowing the Bolshevik Party to operate on Ukrainian territory. So, by the way, just like these 1 year before, the Central Rada had cooperated with the local Bolsheviks, now the Directory was doing the same, cooperating with the Bolsheviks against their new common enemy, Skoropadskyi. And on November 14th, the Directory begins this uprising against Skoropadskyi. Its spokespersons demand the surrender of Skoropadskyi, and as well as all of his supporters. That starts in mid-November. Meanwhile, something else took place. As we all know, on November 11, the German imperial government in Berlin signs an armistice with the Allies, bringing to an end World War I. German troops in Ukraine finally could begin to make their long-awaited return home. They had had enough anyway. And on December 14, they abandoned Kyiv. The forces behind the Directory allowed Germans safe passage, and its leaders, the Directory's leaders, entered the city on December 19. Skoropadskyi abdicates, flees to Germany, and the Directory proclaimed the establishment of the Ukrainian National Republic, or the UNR, the Ukrainian National Republic. And so what do we have? We have seen during this second phase of the Ukrainian Revolutionary Era 8 months of autocratic rule under Hetman Pavlo Skoropadskyi and his German and Austro-Hungarian protectors now comes to an end. Despite its authoritarian nature and despite its dependence on the Russified, well-to-do social strata in Ukraine, as we've seen, the Hetmanate did actually manage for most of its existence to remain Ukrainian in form and at least in education and cultural institutions in content as well. But faced with increasing internal discontent, we saw how Skoropadskyi made a last-minute effort in October to create a common Russian-Ukrainian anti-Bolshevik front, but this failed to save his regime, and by the end of 1918, his German protectors were gone as well. Now, instead of the Hetmanate, the restored Ukrainian National Republic, under the leadership of the Directory, it was left to deal by itself, not only with the anti-Bolshevik Russians, the so-called whites, but with an even greater threat to its existence, the Bolshevik Reds. And it is to that incredibly complicated story that brings us to 1919 and 1920, the last phase of our Ukrainian Revolutionary Era, that we will turn when we come back after reading week. Thank you.